Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today I'm talking with Dr. Erica Robles-Anderson about community in the broad sense, but how the left should start to frame it. And I'm going to go ahead and begin with saying that everything I just said, other than your name, should probably be put in quotation marks, because I think every term in that left community frame
Right.
it is contestable. so
Totally.
so before we get going, can you tell my audience a little bit about your work and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you the kind of since this is like our first time having like a conversation, I'm going to give like some anchor points that seem like they might be useful for us to navigate around. And then we'll see what we want to do with that. So biographically, I'm an associate professor at NYU in a department called Media, Culture, and Communication. So we basically study like everything, right? I think we are the oldest like media studies department effectively in the United States. We were founded in 1970. That's an interesting kind of feature of the way that we've been shaped, and we're internal to an education department. So we look a little interesting and are probably marked by 1970s New York, I think, in our sensibilities. So I came there from Stanford, where I did undergraduate and graduate degrees. I mention this because in my present life, I'm a cultural historian, but I was an undergraduate in the Silicon Valley in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I've seen a few crises, let's say. And I started life thinking I was going to work on engineering and design. So I've always loved like kind of symbolic systems forms, complexity sorts of things, like quantity. And then I moved into the quantitative social sciences. And now I would say that my work is really properly historical, but methodologically the questions have reshaped, but the theoretical and analytical interests have been pretty much the same. So my origin, like my villain backstory, would be that in the 90s and 2000s, thinking about wanting to build stuff, because that's what you do, when you go to school in that area, I was really baffled by the dominant discourse. And I didn't have like a language for this at all, right? So I'm really internal to the process of wanting to build things. I was really baffled by the conception of technology as something that was for individuals, like the individual user experience, the idea that the way that we should conceive of interaction would be through this kind of individual use case. Because it seemed to me like most of the experiences that we have are already pre-boarded as eminently collective things, whether that's through like what I would now think of as like kinship forms, right? Like collectivities, households, organizations, firms, anything in that layer is really not the dominant way that we think about building worlds. And I just think that's a broken paradigm. It really limits the imagination of what's possible, and it does a poor job descriptively for thinking about what counts as agency for historical and technological transformation. So that sort of set me on a path that I have been pursuing, and that I think has pushed me more to think about what political economy has to offer, what various social sciences do and do not have to offer, how we might reconceive of the kind of social research we want to do, and towards what ends we would want to be building. So that's where I would kind of enter around community. Yeah. Let me leave it there for a second.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. When I first encountered you on Twitter, I went and looked up your work, and I was like, oh, there's interest in media and technology. There's also an interest in community and what we mean by that term, because that term is, to me, both important but vitally underdetermined term. Um,
Right.
it's. I remember sitting, in activist meetings are in lecture halls actually, and it's us talking about community, and then going, I've been an educator now for 16 years, and community is a word that gets thrown around there too, and realizing that I had no idea what collectivity we were actually referring to by community at any given stage. But to kind of parallel to the other point that you indicated, um, that my understanding of technology have been limited by this kind of paradigm of individual use cases. It actually made me really not understand, for example, what cybernetics was about until probably about 7-8 years ago, when I was really trying to understand, okay, I read plenty. I know now something about how this was being conceived of, kind of in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and 40s, and that sort of led me down this weird, like, technological, like, research pathway that I've now been kind of on, trying to understand what has happened with cybernetics. Like, why can we talk about it? Like, I've read a whole lot of critical theory. I've been rereading it from Virilio and Baudrillard and going like, oh, well, they think cybernetics is X. I'm reading stuff from the 40s where cybernetics is Y. And been trying to figure out what happened between, say, 1965 to 1990, where, other than some kind of facile arguments based off of etymology, where the perception of this entire field completely changed, both internal to itself and definitely external to itself. So that overlaps with your work, but kind of from the opposite perspective. To be like, my journey's been the other way.
Well, I think we're probably about the same age, right? We're probably, so I'm let's just assume that there's probably something like, I grew up in Texas. We're about the same age. We're both from the same country, right? There's probably some kind of like felt historical something, right? That should be able to structure the range of interests that and we're both educators. So some things happen, but also there should be some overlap that we could probably identify and ask, like, what the hell happened in the last 40 years, right? Like, how should we think about that productively from the inside of our subject position, and also in a way that's like useful for where to go. I have also shared the cybernetics fascination. I took a course in maybe graduate school with two guys who still teach like straight up cybernetics. One who was a student of Gordon Pask, guys who are, like kicking around the valley, who've done a lot of work, like teaching cybernetics for years. And it was a really fascinating class. There were people who would come from Chile, like every year and take it again. Really fascinating group of people. And that kind of cybernetics, which was like a course from first order, second order, and third order, and how to build cybernetic systems, to me seemed also to not at all match both what I have heard about cybernetics, right? The dominant historical narrative, which just cannot get over Norbert Wiener. It's just like stuck right there, like one more story about the Macy conferences, but also that didn't seem to kind of bring the kinds of concepts that I still think are really useful, like requisite variety and conversation. And none of those debates seem to make it into a moment that is like network society, let's say. So something happened in a range of thoughts about how we were going to do organization that obscured some ways of talking about collectivity and its processes, and that papered over a few others. And maybe our job is to kind of rework that terrain and think about what should we be talking about, right? What's the agenda from here?
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room is the internet somehow became, I'm hesitant to say more commodified, because I've been called out on that. Because it's always to some degree been heavily commodified. But the directness and obviousness of that commodification has become more and more apparent to people. I think there is still, there's also the way in which, our lives have been dominated by mass media in a way that even the generation prior to us has a memory of a time before. It's very similar to like the way kids in their 20s, I probably shouldn't say kids, but kids in their 20s experience the world as mediated through the internet in a way that like I can't really address, because I do remember a time before, and there's been a lot of backfiring in that, and this isn't immediately obvious, or doesn't immediately sound like it's relevant to politics. But for example, all the research on early the effects of like the internet on education and on cyber education and all this, were all done on people who had grown up in some ways with the technology, but also still had access to like what the world was like prior to the technology in some degree. So for example, like how people ask questions on Google and how immediately useful it was and how much context you needed to teach. That was all kind of based off of, frankly, not just the normal weird assumptions, white, rich, educated, first world, etc., but also on like, you remember a time when contextualizing questions was more important because it was harder to do research. Therefore, you had to contextualize the questions. And over time, we started noticing, all that original research isn't actually pertinent to what we're seeing with students now. Because all of it was done basically assuming these preconditions and assumptions and community assumptions that were not obvious how temporal and very specific they were. So, because there's always the obvious problems. Most psychological and educational research is done on college students who are from a certain background, but there was also like a very temporal part of that made all that invalid. And what I find interesting also, you have a communications background, and a lot of the early research on this was actually from the communications end of things.
Right.
And they were also some of the people who realized that a lot of the educational assumptions that were being built off of this early data from internet were not panning through even before, say, teachers and pedagogical researchers realized it. And I'm not quite sure why that is. Like, I don't know what the lens of communications gives you there. But it was definitely something I saw, that we did all this research on the effects of, we always say technology, but this is really more specific than that. Like, on education. And I think that's interesting. What I haven't thought about until recently was how that affects community conceptions and whatnot. Because if it affects education, it's also going to affect the community conception. Like how people approach this, what they ask about community formation, etc., would be kind of strongly mediated by our conceptions around technologies and endpoint use data and stuff like that. Does that make sense? That's
totally. So okay. I'm going to sort of like keep reworking this terrain, because I feel like we have the luxury of both being like capacious readers, let's say, right? And then having to kind of broker the range of fields that we care about, like, so that people can find each other, right, with common concerns, who may not speak the same disciplinary languages, right? It's like that's a thing we both care about and care to participate in, I think, right, as educators. So I'm gonna just like be pretty bald about my like critique of whatever some dominant story is, to give us some traction to talk about this technology and computer thing, right, or communication bit and community. So I think we lived through a period where we felt, right, this constant dominant narrative that placed the usual suspects into the driver's seat of agency. Technologies, sometimes financial kind of modes of capital, but those are the kinds of vulgar dialectical things that count as agents of history, and they propel us forward. And the thing which is static and sitting in the background is culture, right? where it is the functional and traditional, and it's backwards somewhere. I'm not sure where it is. Maybe it's far away where those other people are. But we rehearse this kind of like modernity ideology over and over again to propel the idea that, maybe the future comes from like one place in California and it's going to spread and eventually everyone will catch up. And we live with that narrative constantly. And as much as we're critical of that narrative for its obvious absurdities, one thing that we haven't sort of attended to enough is building a language that allows us to reverse the causality or make more constitutive causal claims about the way that what we kind of broadly call culture shapes the migration into new technological regimes, because then you get accused of sort of having your ideas mixed up about whatever the real economic stuff is. That's kind of like I'm going to hand wave and say that that's like the discourse you encounter most often in whatever, in the empire we live in. Mm-hmm. So the goal might be to think about what you'd have to do to make a kind of constitutive causality appear. So cybernetics kind of, we might want to pull from that. We might want to think about studies of communion, symbolic exchange, modes of social production that are generative as economic transactions so that we don't bifurcate those. We might want to find a language to disavow public-private distinctions. We might want to sort of open up the terrain of the terms that need to come together so that we can both get out of that sort of modernity story where technics is both the cause of our isolation and the promise of the cure to connect us back together in this network. And then open it up to some other kinds of descriptive processes and also things that we can use to organize different kinds of worlds. And so that's a huge problem, but it's definitely, or at least I will say, it's the problem that has gotten me out of bed every day for the last 2 decades. And that to me seems like it needs 1,000 more hands on deck working that out, as a project, which gets us to this problem of community, right? So if you'll belabor, there's one more piece we have to put in here to kind of mess with, which is we also lived through, right, the 1989 moment and the 1995 moment and the 2001 moment. But there was a fantasy about the nation that comes through Ben Anderson's work on imagined community, that is about living in a flat, modern, homogenous time that is linear, where the new symbolic thing is going to be either forms of nation carried in language, something like that. We're living in we live in the wake of that being a dominant story for how community operates and persists. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that there are all kinds of problems with that story. There always have been. And they run neatly alongside the problems of putting technics into the role of modernizing constantly towards the next available stage. I think we should dump that all mostly out, or at least sideline it for a while so that we can work on these problems of sufficient alignment to carry on, which gets us to education, maybe.
Yeah. Subtly, you have probably upset every Marxist in the room.
I know, but that's okay. That's fine. That's true. That's true.
Just actually pointed out for the Marxists who haven't realized they should be angry.
Sorry,
but I think there's a lot of key points in that we should I've been, it's funny how much our concerns parallel each other in a kind of different way, but are generationally consistent. I have been racking my mind over how the conception of nations and nationalisms have gotten specifically leftist, but in a larger sense, everybody, but in cul-de-sacs for a long time, that if you try to start reconciling what that sort of modernist view of a nation is, which itself is tied into techniques, because you're right, one of the things that Benedict Anderson's particular version of that story does is say, well, the printing press is why nations exist.
Absolutely.
So, the national formation is not just an imagined community of language. It's imaginative community of language that is possible because of communication technology, and it's flattened out. over my 20 years of dealing with this, and also trying to figure out how to talk about like cultures and nations responsibly, I've really come to doubt that Anderson narrative as actually super explanatory ever, but particularly not right now.
It's my favorite hate read, I'll be honest.
Okay. Yeah, it's to me, you know, Anderson is like trying to do the thing where where he takes a Marxist conception and kind of like makes it more copacetic to standard understandings, but also I think it creates more problems than it solves. And this got me to like one of the questions that we talked about privately when I first asked you if you want to do this interview. You know, you asked me like, why don't we talk more about why social reproduction is not looked at as primary versus like production. And I realized that, again, might have different reasons for how we came to this conclusion, but that like this has been something I've been really interested in too, because social reproduction is where relations of production come from, and this really like old school Marxist way of understanding things. And relations of productions actually determine the mode of production. Yet when we talk about that, we actually seem to talk about it like entirely inverted, as if modes of production just like arrive because some machine exists and we don't even know how to explain that. And then all of a sudden, like, bam, everything changes. Which is not really Marx's particular way of describing the world, but it is like the implications of focusing mostly on production and then going, well, you know, but production's also social, so it's social relations too. But really, there's capitalism. By capitalism, what we actually mean is industrial capitalism going, you know,
right,
et cetera, et
right.
cetera.
Yeah. I mean, it binds us into so we can say like, look, you could be really good about the kind of fidelity to what Marx or any thinker enables, right? And we should hold and do right by those thinkers. We can also track the communities of reception and the ways that the work gets used as a useful kind of social problem. Why is it picked up in this way? By whom? To who is this useful, et cetera? And those are like both useful pursuits, right? The way that Marxism fits alongside this dominant story that we tell is that in both cases, it allows a number of people with vested interests to describe a liberal kind of modernity that is headed somewhere, you know? And I want to reject that metaphysically, but it lets us sideline a lot of very difficult problems to solve, right? Like making people and relations is it's an effortful endeavor. And whether or not the intellects themselves didn't mean to make the difference so stark, one thing anthropology unfortunately teaches us is that the kinds of gendering differences that we see in kinship forms radically predate and exceed like anything that looks like an industrial economy. Yep. So we have to tangle with that, both as how does it make us think about the theory, right? And like, what can this theory do? And how is this theory also, like every theory, like part of its own historical moment, in a way that if we want to keep the ideas moving and work with them, we have to have a critique of or a recognition of the historical subject as well. So I'll give you like a really concrete example. When we set up this kind of techniques and stages model, then we have to tell the story about agrarian or domestic modes of production that have to become industrial, and then they become post-industrial. That means that we haven't bothered to think about the fact that an enormous amount of post-industrial society piggybacks on domestic modes of production. Like we just haven't sat down and articulated how, like we're both, I mean, I'm at home right now, right? Like literally I work from home. The internet is mostly a thing I do at home, right? So that's an ordinary and everyday experience, but it certainly reverses the sensibility of where the economy and political economy is a matter of concern. And we just haven't bothered to do that because it's the thing that's supposed to be back there, and that's just sloppy. I mean, we could do it, right?
Yeah, I think the question of like social relations of gender, relations of sex, relations of social reproduction, is something that really got me and started me kind of breaking me out of like the assumptions of whatever Marx imported from classical political economy into Marxist assumptions, because I would look at, because I am educated in anthropology, funny you bring that up, that like I know, for example, that immediate return hunter-gathering has very gender relations. It is, in almost all cases, more relatively egalitarian than, say, our current situation between genders. But it is varied. Intergender violence is varied, etc., which starts to lead you to a question of, okay, it can't solely be that this is just automatically coming out of quote printed the communism and immediate return hunter-gatherer relations, right? Once you realize that, you start looking at other things like, okay, I always assumed, and I think, Ingalls' work on the family is fairly good on this, although it is also it's extremely old at this point, that agricultural societies led to things like viewing women as property. And then I started looking more at different agricultural societies, and it turns out, that is the case a lot of the time, but it can't actually be deemed determinative in a strict way. That can't be the cause, because there are plenty of agricultural societies. Christopher Ryan points to some of these in kind of questionable ways, but that don't actually end up replicating like marriage in that way that that is assumed in like the Ingalls early anthropological picture, that, well, women get treated as property and domestic rulers of the home with agriculture, because also kinship becomes more important, because proving parentage becomes more important for genetic. There's all kinds of assumptions that are built into that, and you start looking at the actual index of societies we know about, and you hit the, well, that's true most of the time, but it's not true all the time, so it can't be solely determinative. And that actually does damage to this whole like modes are that determinative of the way communities and social organization goes. And I think that's something to think a lot about when we start talking about community in this sense. Now, this is probably going to seem very abstract to people, so maybe we can start trying to ground.
We can ground things too. I mean, maybe it's useful to kind of think about what examples feel helpful to think with, because, I mean, I think, like, if I'm hearing what you're saying, like, once I started noticing this problem too, I was like, wait, how is this question of social relations not like really, like, how are people out there feeling confident in their social theory when social relations isn't central? If it's a peripheral question, or like if if they have the week on social reproduction, I just feel like, wow, like that just seems like a really inadequate solution to the thought. And so once you start seeing it, you kind of can't stop seeing it and wishing to do work in that. So I don't know which kinds of examples resonate with people. But like, I mean, you could take something like in the COVID moment, the discourses between, invisible labor, right? As this suddenly discovered thing in the pages of, exactly the kind of bourgeois like periodicals you'd guess, or like the New York Times are like, oh, the labor of like the women is so invisible. Like, I don't think it's invisible. It's funny that it keeps being rediscovered as forgotten, right? But that the invisible labor is not the same as the essential worker is a tip-off that there is something that is not merely constitutively gender as a structure. There's an economic question that needs to be unpacked as a political economy, internal to domestic economies, that absolutely has a kind of relation to the market. Like, not everybody's workload went up because some people worked in other people's homes, for example, and so they couldn't come to that job because you couldn't have your nanny or your house cleaner in. So it's not that women's labor is invisible. It's that there are always domestic economies. And similarly, like, some professions happen at home, which means housing has to be a key engine of social differentiation that's an asset. And we have to think about assets, not merely wages and wage gaps, but just this much more complex formulation of what counts as economic activity. And like, we live with that all the time. We live with remittance economies, we live with inheritances, we live with family firms. That's just stuff that tends to be peripheral as a matter of inquiry, but it doesn't have to be.
So one of the things I think that this leads me to thinking about the structure of communities is the way both intentional structures that emerge from the interaction of individuals, such as the way people interact on Twitter, are undergirded by this like massive public infrastructure that does seem to be semi-invisible, i.e., because it doesn't manifest itself at the endpoint of the user. It's not really thought about. When we think about, like, the cloud doesn't take up as much energy as like physical storage, and I'm like, it doesn't take much energy on the standpoint of your personal computer,
right?
But from the standpoint of where that server bank is, actually, it probably takes up more. But that is not entirely hidden, but somewhat hidden from view. It's hidden in the way that, like, it's not a secret, it's not but it's not brought out. And second, with this, you bring up care work, which all of a sudden got temporarily prioritized as part of this whole invisible labor trend in COVID. That was interesting to me, because I was like, well, how is this not always obvious?
Right. Exactly. This is not hidden. Nobody made this invisible.
Because the person used to take care of someone with cancer, I can tell you this has never really been that invisible. In fact, it was the primary thing in my life.
Right. And it's a huge chunk of like economic activity in a country, right? Like, it's not if you would just wanted to account for stuff, it's not a small portion of the things people get up to.
Well, I mean, you would, like, what is it, like, the service economy is a huge portion of the individual consumer's actual engagement in the economy, and a whole lot of the service economy is just trying to enable the thing that we're talking about, which is the maintenance of family and whatnot, and community in other ways, whether it's intentional or not. This stuff is there.
Yeah. So recently, I know there was the big SVB meltdown thing. And, I tuned into some of the venture types talking about the need for the bailouts, right? Bailouts. And I am always curious. I guess my ears perk up when the language shifts. They were like, we need this for the innovation community. Like, who is the innovation community? Like, what an interesting use, right, of the term. And we saw it yesterday as well with the Starbucks founder, right, who was saying, like, he made it by himself, right? He grew up in public housing. He went to public schools. He got here on his own with his billions, but he's always been so proud to share his profits with the people of Starbucks. And I'm like, when you start hearing community and people, like, it's doing some kind of work, for better or worse, right? And not as a judgment, but it's interesting to watch what can't be talked about as an economic relation. And I think we get into trouble if we keep trying to separate economy and society from each other, because it keeps us from developing a language that would allow us to talk about the fact that I'm sure venture capital dude does feel some version of sympathy, right, for people who have similar interests that he does. Is that we could talk about that as a class? That's another kind of collectivity. We could talk about it in all kinds of ways, but a cartel, right? But we should have a more robust language for not having to purify the community ones as the absolutely anti-economic, no resources required kinds of organic connection. I just don't think anything meets that standard, frankly.
Right. If that's what community is, then it doesn't exist.
Yeah, then it doesn't exist, right? And then you feel like a chump for like wanting and wishing to feel some relationship to other people. So it's not a helpful road in that sense.
Yeah, I remember I had this realization when I first got into vulgar Marxology land, probably about 10 years ago, and I was talking about organic community, and then it stopped and thought about that for a second. And I was like, when the hell was there ever an organic community? Like, what community just exists? But I guess what we actually mean by organic community is community that is presaged on, organic relations, which is actually usually law. Which is actually prompting the so-called organic relation, as opposed to the economic relations, which is somehow not law, even though it is law, really, because law is what girds how we. When I realized that, I was like, oh, this distinction is not like, it's one of those distinctions that, as like in a common language way, I get it and I get why we say it. But when the moment you actually press on it at all, you start seeing, oh, this was never like, I'm positing something about modernity that implies a discontinuity with the past, that if you look at it for 30 seconds without the language of modernity being imposed on it, you realize that there actually isn't that much of a distinction.
Like, yeah, and it has teeth, right? So it's like, we could be like, it's fine. People use words however they want, but it has real teeth in two ways. It sets you up to think about what kinds of things should we look at, right? What are the serious things to care about? And then we invest more kind of effort in studying those and keep not looking at others, which isn't going to help us create a better model. And the second thing is that it allows you to do that nostalgic move of like, it was better back then. And the reason that, and now we're broken, we're fragmented and alone. What will solve it, right? And this is where some form of something has to step in to promise this reunification, right? So you kind of get stuck in this like Lapsarian Fort Dog game, that is unsolvable. And so I just don't, there's not a politics there that is actionable, actually.
Yeah, actually, yeah. And I guess that is why there's kind of sometimes a clean movement between like vulgar Marxist and weird ass religious reactionaries. Because
this is the red brown line.
Right. Because there is a real sense in which, like, well, if I have reified the categories to that term, yes, Marxism tells me, like, as a meta principle, that this is better than the past because the past was even more exploitative in its own kind of. It's also a questionable Whiggish thing, but that if I just abandon that one element, it's very easy to go back to, well, when we still have ritual symbolization. I'm actually reading a ton of Bung Ho Chan Han right now, and his disappearance ritual, and I'm like, I get why he has this long disclaimer in the book, like, please don't read this as a way to go back and talk about how everything was better when we had ritual, because the book without that disclaimer seems to lead people to do that. And I'm like, yeah, and that can lead you to some very weird places about the past, because what he's actually describing is differences in the way we conceptualize mediation. And what the endpoint of that is. Not like, wasn't it cool when we had public rituals? I mean, you know, I mean, even that, like the line between what is a public ritual and what isn't a public ritual is actually somewhat hard to clear out.
Totally hard. Yeah. So when I started thinking about this seriously, I think at that point I had thought, okay, I know what I'll do. I will stop being a builder for a little while, and I will become an experimental psychologist. And I will use my building skills to make these like networked screen systems, and I will show that you can do things to environments to create this shared collective experience. And that's a thing, you know, that there are features of it that we could like scientifically study it. And my writing just kept getting like weirder and weirder. You know, I don't know that that's the best method to attack those questions. And so there was a real kind of break for me, and luckily a very supported one in terms of the mentors I had, where I was like, you know, I need to go find examples in the world of places and organizations where collectivity is upfront, where they really like, they buy into ritual and communitas and the whole 9 yards, and then study how they do innovative things with organizational form and technology to try to invert that question so that there could be a language about this kind of mediation. And so I started studying megachurches because they could bankroll, they had the capital to install these massive sort of technological systems. They're super innovative in terms of organizational form in the back half of the 20th century. And that sort of set me down a road of studying, you know, conservatives, which is predominantly what my historical research has been on for the last 15 years. Because I think it disrupts exactly this binary. It's like all of these places where all the traditional backness is supposed to be are building stuff. So how are they doing that? And how do they talk about it? That's a good tip off that it can't possibly be a backwards.
Yeah, this is similar to when I realized that the best examples of dual power in the 20th century were Hezbollah and Hamas. Like,
right. Those are great examples, actually. Exactly.
And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. Let's figure out what they're doing, whether,
yeah.
And it's actually interesting because that also indicates, that's both interesting to me because there is an innovation in mega churches. There's also been kind of a collapse of their social cohesion in the last, I think it's pretty recent. I think it's like last 10 years. That I'm also interested in, like, why did they hit that wall? Because if you'd asked me in 2000, even as late as like 2006, 2007, definitely post 9/11, if mega churches were going to start really showing social limits and breaking down and showing the kinds of social pathologies we associate with like very insular communities, I would have thought you're way what are you on? These people are too cohesive and too powerful. But it also is interesting how much this idea of, well, rational people will produce rational technologies is not supported when you actually go and like, okay, the people that you think are backward social reactionaries are better at technology than you, are more innovative, and sometimes weirdly, without even meaning to be, more egalitarian in their actual structures than you. And that's got to be something that should make people uncomfortable.
Yeah, that totally should. And I would totally agree. I mean, I think if you had asked, well, how should I put this? I think I also would have, if you'd asked me in 2005, I think I would have had the same exact reaction as you. By the financial crisis, let's say 2008-9 through 2012-ish, something really changed for them, right? I mean, they got hit with the same, I think, the same conditions of crisis and the conjuncture of a transforming internet publishing industry, digital publishing, like everyone else. And they show so many of the features of other industries that are adjacent. At the same time, the challenge, and maybe this is the case, you know, on the left, is to think about how these institutions and organizations, even when they didn't last forever, lasted for long enough to train an enormous number of people, to give them a pedagogy for how to do growth, and cells of it convert multitudes. And that stuff carries on in the bodies of the actors who've been through those worlds and moved on to other professions. It diffuses into other parts of their social life, and they use those skills that were quite practiced in these environments. And so we can keep tracking the implications even after some particular form sort of seemingly breaks down.
Yeah, it's interesting because I live in Utah, and you want to talk about one of the most effective and technologically advanced conservative social
100%.
organizations that I've ever seen in my life.
Absolutely.
And has been, what I find interesting about it is it's done some things that like leftists ostensibly want, but they have no idea how to do. And I don't think they actually understand the implications of. One of which is here. Utah is a state where there's still a lot of people who know people from other social classes. And that actually is mostly thanks to the LDS. And that's just not the case almost anywhere else in the United States I've been or am from or anything like that, where you just don't, people really do not have that great of an idea of the way other people live, even though we are ostensibly more connected through these technologies. But since these technologies, to bring it back to the point you brought up all the way back, tend to be focused on the individual user endpoint and somehow reflecting the individual user endpoint back to themselves, or even predicting what they think that is. They being the people marketing stuff to you. It weirdly leads to the whole Jonathan Haidt freak out. Like, oh, everyone's just become narcissists because everything's reflected back at them. I'm like, well, I mean, as a Christopher Lasch scholar, I can tell you that everyone's been calling everybody narcissists for like a half century now. So that's not new and can't be blamed on the internet. But there is this cordoning off. And then I'm like, but then we have to ask ourselves, like, okay, if a left wants to do some of the stuff that we see social conservatives do or mega churches do, what do they have to give up? Or what can they not inculcate? Because I do like to remind people that, like, leftist goals just from a strategic standpoint are actually going to always be harder than, say, right-wing goals, because we're not starting from a status quo norm. Like, they're just like definitionally, like orientationally, it's a harder sell. So what are some things that you noticed about these organizations, like the way they use technology or the way they organize themselves?
So after spending, I thought, after spending a lot of time at church, like I've been secular my whole life. I'm now like affiliated in religious studies. I'll probably study religion forever. It's fascinating stuff. But I didn't know that at the time. So when I started going through the archives and looking at how they managed to Protestantism was not known for being massive, right? That's what Catholics did. And so it really did take a lot of teaching people to regard material culture in different ways to legitimate this form. And so I don't want to undersell how many alignments were required to make that system work. I think one of the core things about those alignments is that you will often see, always, people who are quite heterogeneous actors come together who don't totally see each other's visions, but they can find the right elements to see how both of their visions are able to be furthered in this moment. They can do this coordinating move. And I think that coordinating move is really different than an impulse towards mass politics of agreement, where the idea is like a massifying of power that then overturns, right, the kind of vulgar Gramscian sensibility. This ain't that. This is a much more constitutive, and so I'll kind of pull in the cybernetics and communication part here. This is a kind of constitutive set of coordinations between people in relatively different social arenas that is, and all of those things are required, along with a kind of public culture that can hold it up, to make this happen over time. And I think that's a really different strategy, and one that we probably could do a lot to develop. So once I was pretty deep in the archives, thinking about like how the organizations that were early to this strategy managed to convince others to do it, and convince them that this was an appropriate thing to do, you'd see something like big donors, some big donors, not a lot of big donors, but some big donors. And the big donors I saw were coming from similar industries. Namely, and this will get us to Utah, namely multi-level marketing.
Yeah.
Right. And this is early, like Fortis family era multi-level marketers. So people who were coming out of Michigan also, right? Who are absolutely in union areas in the late 40s, who are moving west towards places like Utah and California, who are shifting laws about who counts as an independent contractor and who's an employee. You know, these pieces are moving together, and people are buying into a vision that is reconfiguring the boundary between like households and their capital and these massive organizations, though the two don't look alike, right? And so at that point I was like, okay, I sound like an Althusserian. I'm like, here's the church, here's the house. We probably should be talking about education in the school also, and the changes that are happening that make possible something like a homeschool movement in our moment. And you find some of the same people, right? Or people who are married to people, or people who know people, not in a conspiratorial way, but it's interesting to start all my work is mapping this stuff. And I would say that in the mapping of it, you start to think about an organizational strategy that's about topologies of coordination, and who you kind of strategically know you need to know enough to keep a kind of field moving in a certain direction, but they don't have to be the same kind of people. In fact, it's best if they speak very different languages from one another.
That's an interesting point. Well, so I come from the Deep South, a different part of the Deep South than you. You're from Texas, which yeah. It rhymes, but Texas is its own particular place. So,
right.
So I'm not claiming we have similar experiences here, but I'm intimately aware of the homeschool movement because it actually caught members of my family early on. And one of the things I can tell you is that was how I learned what BYU was. Because the first place of when the internet first started coming along in the 90s, if you were a homeschool parent and you didn't have, particularly if you weren't a particularly like religious one, ironically, the best place to find a curriculum was BYU. Put it all out there. Also, they were doing it for their own evangelical-ish purposes, but it didn't really matter. It was an okay curriculum put out there. As part of what I do now is my day job, and I don't talk about my day job much because I'm a public educator in Utah, but is actually trying to form a public option within the public school to compete with the BYU services. It's like almost explicitly for that. And so, yeah, I know it overlaps, but it doesn't speak the same language. It's one of the things that you're right about. Like, if you would think, okay, BYU, it's going to be some weird Mormon evangelical stuff. And yet, when you actually dig into it, that wasn't why people were using it in Georgia. That wasn't why the homeschool movement, when it caught members of my family's Jewish and Catholic. They were never part of that Protestant homeschool thing. And yet, they got sucked into that world tangentially by homeschool, and why homeschool had an appeal for them is also interesting because it's tied into this social reproduction stuff. It wasn't actually because of ideological reasons. It was because a lot of us were working, to keep my family afloat. And my younger brother used that to continue working, and also he had kids young, and raise his kids and get something like a high school diploma. And so it served this function that the public school kind of couldn't serve, particularly at that time. I mean, like, because we're talking late 90s. And I started, retrojecting. I started thinking about that experience. I'm like, yeah, we don't do things that enable this. Now, this is not in a union stronghold, whatever, but you're absolutely right. One of the things about Utah that I think people don't understand, even though union penetration is not great here, it's not great in a lot of places. It's still so much stronger than most of the rest of the Mountain West. Like, it's actually like our public school unions are actually significantly more, and they used to be also significantly more larger, and they used to be significantly more militant even, and they were tied into specifically LDS community issues. And so that's led me to think about, this religious component of it in a different way. It hasn't made me want to convert, not gonna that's not what it's done, but it has made me look at like, okay, they understand things about social organization that we don't. Another thing that I'm gonna say, for however patriarchal their ideology is, and it's pretty damn, women's work and women's validation is often more forefront than it is in left stuff.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I mean, I've spent a lot of time I spent a lot of time with multi-level marketers. That is where, if you wanted to study like women and business, that's the place to do it, right? Like, there are plenty of people who are absolutely the financial center of their families, even if they, on the one hand, continue to speak a language about like gender differences. If you look at the accounting forms of what makes that work, right? If you look at the business charts that are also often kinship diagrams, you will see matrilines that just don't represent if you don't look at it closely. And that's, it's fine that it isn't, but I think that sort of not taking the 10,000 feet back view, like at face value from, let's say, like the chattering classes about how lefts and rights are, you start to see this kind of attention to, okay, how do we practice coordinating work? How do we practice organizing that makes these kinds of portraits like deeply interesting and really important? I mean, obviously I'm bought in, right? To study and think about like, well, what would we do, right? Like, why can't I find the let's say I'm just going to pick on the DSA because they can take it. They're big enough, right? Why don't they have like the equivalent of the BYU curriculum up and running for people who are educating K through 12, right? Like, that just doesn't even exist as a thing they work on and publicly create resources for, but Hillsdale does it for free, and like, that's a low bar. Most of these texts are available. You could make study guides for fifth graders or whatever the case available.
Yeah, I'm often shocked that like I'm making a reading list for people on my show that I'm like, well, why hasn't this been done and been made available for free and put out there, other by than like Verso or whoever who's clearly selling you a book,
right?
But yeah, I mean, I started wondering this when I was like, I started dealing with female representation in left media. It's been something that I've thought a lot about. But I also would be like, okay, so I go to a DSA meeting, it's 80% men. I'm in the left media space. It's worse than 80% men. Like, I brag about having 20% female audience, and that's actually kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And that's kind of pathetic. But
thank you for saying that.
yeah, I know it is kind of pathetic, but it's better than a lot of other shows. But
it's not as good as conservative media.
No, it's not. That's what I was saying. Conservative media is like 50% women. Like, and the other thing I would think, like, when I go do stuff for church, like, women are front and forward. When I do stuff with left stuff, if it's I can't use my union because my union is gender skewed to an extreme. But if I was to say, look at, like, my partner does activist work, and it's almost always I go out and help, and I'm like one of 3 men out of like 27 people there. And yet when I go to these political meetings, not just, in the media space, it's 80%. Even if their leadership is 50% or more women, the actual membership is 80% men. And it led me to think about, what about social reproduction? What about valorization? What about like immediate payoff? Do these conservative organizations understand that we don't? Are these religious organizations who are supposed to be beyond being political, but they're not? We all know they're not. What do they understand that we don't?
What do you think? I mean, because I'd be curious. I mean, I don't know if you feel comfortable saying.
I think one of it is more intimately tied to social reproduction. It's immediately and intimately tied to that. Another is, it has to be a space for families to exist in. Whereas I think left stuff has actually been predicated on young people with few social ties, because the what you get to what you give ratio has actually never been actually particularly good, with the exception of unions. But even there, it's gotten to be a harder and harder call because of structural reasons. So like when you join a left organization, right, you're fighting to change the world, but almost all payoffs to you are like way down the road. Like probably you are never going to see them even if you succeeded. And so there's that. I also think some of it's their models are based off of, I've been trying to tell people, it's great that we can talk about what the unions and socialist political parties did in the 19th century. And it is actually good to study that, because they did a lot of things we don't do. Like, there was socialist soccer leagues and shit like that.
Yeah.
And you were actually, when people were talking about, I remember because of the sexual harassment issues, people were talking about banning dating between socialists. And I was like, that's like banning dating at church. That's stupid. Just that's not how people work. But also, okay, but I get why you think that, because your only model for organizing and accountable leadership actually is like a corporate model, whether you realize it or not. So I think that's part of it. But I don't know. I mean, there's an inherent irony to me in it that I have not been totally able to reconcile. And I have talked about it a little bit, but it makes so many people uncomfortable, because they think, a lot of people think when you say this, like you're extolling their social norms. And I'm like, I'm not extolling their, like, I don't think it's a virtue thing. I don't think it's about like what they say they believe. I think there's something else going on there about the structures and integration. Particularly churches, but not just churches. You talk about multi-level marketing stuff like that. For a very brief time, my mother pulled my family into Amway. Like I know what it's like, and they continued to do it for a long time, even though they realized it was not going to make them rich after a while.
But it's still not gonna. I mean, it's interesting to talk to people who do it, because like I've talked to a number of people who've done a range of them over time, and I haven't found anyone who's as in debt from it as small business entrepreneurs who do things like start restaurants that fail in like the first year or two.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So it's like, well, if you're thinking about like, how am I going to deal with the fact that I can't get a sufficient wage in a market? What is my ecology of options, right? Then the buy-in level for some of these things is just the capital required is so small compared to what it would take to start something that's regarded as a legitimate business. And the levels of financial ruin are still interestingly like,
they're lower. I mean,
right. They're like lower. People with student debt can easily have 6 figures of debt. I've never met anybody who has 6 figures of like supplements debt or something, like that. I mean, it's part of the world we live in. And I think it's useful to talk about those things, even so we can just figure out what are the range of reasons people practice whatever they practice.
This is actually an interesting point that I have not thought about till right now. So I'm not going to my parents did Amway. They from their standpoint blew a lot of money on it. However, they continued to do it for many years after they felt like it was not going to deliver off of like the Zig Ziglar promises, because it inculcated them into a social circle. And you're actually, the other point that you're right, when they stopped, they didn't lose a bunch of money either. Like it was not like opening a business, which is something that my family also tried to do, and that was a disaster. That was bankruptcy for years.
Yeah.
So it's, it's something that I think is looked down upon because yes, it is a highly exploitative market, but then we use it not to look at how many other things are highly exploitative markets.
Right.
In some ways more so.
Right.
Like it's just not obvious.
I mean, we both have degrees, right? Like,
oh yeah, I have ridiculous amount of students that I'm gonna probably die with.
Right. And like, if there are pyramids, we can't exempt ourselves from that kind of discussion.
Yeah, and you're right. Also, the capital required is much lower. Like, I mean, so do we think part of why multi-level marketing is so stigmatized is because it's primarily female?
I think that is probably a big piece of how it gets going, and it's an abiding question. And when it's regarded as a thing that's predatory, it's usually like you'll hear the community word pop up, the Black and Latino community. Like the kind of biggest defender in the last 10 years has been Bill Ackerman, who's like a hedge fund dude, who's like, I am, taking a short position on Herbalife as a defender of the Black and Latino community, who I've now met and I am championing. I'm like, none of this makes any sense. But of course, he's the SVB guy who's also saying the same thing about the innovation community. So I think we have to at least presume that part of our allergy to some forms of capital more than others, as opposed to a kind of blanket critique, let's say, is that there are these other senses that something is matter out of place. It's happening in the wrong space somehow. I think that I'm not an apologist for any of these things. I just think, if we want to be responsible and do social inquiry, that can't be the posture of figuring out why people do what they do, especially if we want to build other things from it.
That's a good, that's actually a good point. I think, one of the things, I mean, we know about like fields that have been valorized because it became masculinized. The obvious is low level coding, which was traditionally, whatever the fuck traditional means when we're talking about a field that's only existed for 100 years. What until the 1960s was associated with women in clerical work and relatively low levels of education, and then when it became more lucrative, it became associated with men. We know about that, and I personally talk a lot about like why primary education, even though everything we've ever seen says it's more important than secondary education, and I say this as a secondary educator, is not valorized. It's because like it's extremely feminized, and so feminized actually that if men go into primary education because of it's associated with young children, there's a whole lot of assumption that you're a creep. And that's absolutely that's like the nice word for it. So it's like super stigmatized, and I think it's something that we don't like. Leftist, from the Marxist perspective, I should actually just probably say Marxist, do you have an issue dealing with, because we would love to pretend that this is that we can disaggregate and also subordinate gender relations and all this, because I guess we have to run some kind of eternal battle against liberal feminists or something. I don't really know what that's about, but like right. I mean, even liberal feminists found some liberal feminist traits annoying, so I don't really know why getting hung up on the discourse about that is, because we're all kind of missing the train here on communities that seem to be able to to incorporate different elements of social reproduction into how they maintain themselves, and they do tend to be more viable than most of the organizations that the left throws out.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, do you think there's a day when we won't have to use the word social reproduction to talk about social theory?
Just talk about social theory, and
Just
we
social
include
theory?
like relations include, you know, the primary one that most of us care the most about. Like,
Right. The how did we get here? Right? Like, you know,
how we get here, and how we don't go crazy from isolation. Yeah. I it's one of the things that I sometimes wonder if Marxists have, like, right, we always insist it's political economy, and I'm sometimes like, well, what we should probably, and we always talk about social theory, but we're always subordinating one element to the other, like, instead of having to admit, like, it's a very complex thing. You know, I always refer to my family as working class, in both the Marxist and the liberal form of it. But, you know, as I'm sitting here explaining to you, they've also kind of sort of been petite bourgeois. They've also kind of sort of been, well, they tried to be business owners. They're invested, you know, very mildly, not a lot, but, you know, they've tried to scale away their investments, which means they're tied into owning capital in some indirect way. And they're definitely, for most of my life, like right at the poverty, like what was considered the functional poverty line, which I consider the Pell Grant line, not like the absolute weird, unchanging, eternal, like $18,000 a year that we've had for like since the 70s or whatever for the poverty line. But I find that we don't discuss it that way at all. And so when we approach like working class people, I don't think we approach a lot of, you know, we actually talk to them about the way they experience their lives, which I do think is actually often an advantage that, frankly, churches do have. And I think it doesn't help that so many of us on the left are like urbanites in areas where those institutions actually aren't common. And they also don't know what social roles they fill in for. Because, you know, I've pointed out the people in this, like when we talk about the South, I'm like, there is, like, even when there's like like federal welfare, it's so poorly administered that basically half what's holding, you know, the Black community and like most poor white communities together is like a church soup kitchen, and the fact that you can go there relatively shame-free and eat. And when you talk about, like, say, Utah, the LDS has a advanced welfare system completely independent of government. Like, it's actually kind of crazy. I live like 3 blocks away from like their granary. Right. You know, it's like when
the apocalypse comes, like,
right? They have a granary, and that's also part of how they keep tithes up, because people do feel like they get something for it, not just, you know, not just eternal life or the temple recommend or whatever.
But I think there are things. I mean, there are things that we could do, right? So, what are the things that we actually have in spades? Gosh, we have a lot of really educated people who can teach stuff, right? Who can work against skill hoarding, you know, for free. Like, we could do that. Like education is really expensive, and boy, we have a lot of people who could be tutoring, right? Or could be translating concepts, who could be making, like, you know, curricula for things. Like, those are ordinary problems that you can solve. And that we're probably equipped to help with. And so I think part of it is deciding, like, all right, let's like be efficacious, you know, like what is the abundance that you can organize to kind of take a prosperity line, because there's a kind of permanent base of need that you can fill, because that's kind of how churches think about it when they make a ministry, right? It's like, what is a community need that we think we have the resources to be able to provision? And who are people who can kind of solve that problem? And that in and of itself is a kind of, you know, community building exercise for the people who have come from different positions, but share enough of a common interest in producing a kind of world to become disciples, let's say, in studying how to do that work together and fulfilling something that they take to be like a mission, right?
Do you think we don't do that because we're too invested in like official government institutions doing that?
Okay, well, I'm going to frame that back to you.
Okay.
I'm very baffled by the seeming distinction between the like statist versions of left interest and the more mutual aid anarchic versions of left interest as strategies. And these two groups, I'm going to say this totally is like social science brain, right? It's interesting to me how they shape up and how much religion still features, as well as like abolition and sort of Black churches on the side that looks to me less invested in state solutions. Mm-hmm. And that I find fascinating, right? Like it's not that nobody on the left cares about the role of religion in bringing about social change. Like Islam and Christianity are all over that scene. But it's an anti-state, there's no faith in the state as the solution in that mode of it. And so is there a rapprochement possible? Is there something that could be done to commensurate? I don't know.
I don't know. This is where I become a dirty Bolshevik, but where I'm just like, well, dual power institutions are about like, you don't trust the people who run the state, but you're not necessarily against government existing. Right. So that you're building parallel institutions to them. And I do kind of feel like we get stuck in this cul-de-sac between waiting for government actors to do what we want them to do, which we have no evidence that they're ever going to, barring things that we can't immediately do right now or I can't say on air, and thinking we could recapitulate the entire government apparatus like in a small community where you might be able to do that, but it's not going to scale. So, and when you think about churches, you're absolutely right. But then I'm like, yeah, but the churches themselves don't really care. I mean, yes, they care about government because they care about manifesting their power, but they're not trying to. Most of them are not trying to get rid of the U.S. government.
Right, like, not at all. But it doesn't mean there's they've had a range of relationships, let's say, to the state, right? And so that whole space of organizations is not the space that has traditionally dominated political economic concerns. Economists want ideally everything would be a flat and total market, right? Or you'd have some kind of top-down total structure, this intermediate layer that is heterogeneous and never total, that is kind of intermediate, is civil society in all of its formulations. And I think it's never going to be all one way, but I can't see how you mass something up to take the state and then build out whatever institutions hold social reproduction thereafter. I don't see how that's not a constitutive problem of having things hold the frame while you're also doing organizing work, because don't you need all of those things to make people?
Yeah, you do. I mean, it's just funny when we talk about like successful, like radical movements, whether they were revolutionary or even reformist. You actually do see that. You usually see like it's not that there's a line of state and non-state actors. There's actually a gradient, and they are coordinating, and they have no problem with those things being somewhat separate and diffuse. I do think there's a tendency, and maybe this is a bad habit of modernity because it's something I've increasingly started pushing back on with leftists, and I've been pushing back on it not in the normal like centralization versus decentralization, but just like talking about structures and math. Like, look, like there's a trade-off between fragility and cascades failure and centralized efficiency, and you can't pretend that there's not a trade-off there. That's like something that's beyond like that's not like something I'm going to ideologically get around. It's like that's physics. So
oh man, thermodynamics will get you like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, that's a great example though. So like, how do you how do you talk about that as a, like, what do you do with that?
I don't know. I mean, I do. Like, my big despair is often like when we learn good lessons from like churches or whatever, we still can't scale it. And part of that is resources. Churches have access to monetary resources that leftists generally don't know how to valorize. Although I will say, when I hear the left doesn't have any money, I'm like, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. But and I will also say, like I said earlier, our goals are different, but there are certain things that I wonder why we don't do. Like, even from like the status apparatchik think tank thing, one of the things that I've noticed that even non-church conservative organizations do is they will build ideologues by going out and finding smart people amongst actually relatively poor people and training them up. And it's totally cynical, but it works. And there's a weird actual entrepreneurial bootstrappy thing on the left in regards to this. Like no one's going out and finding, like, I don't know, like poor women and being like, okay, we're going to make sure not only that you become a media figure, but we're going to make sure you get the good education because we're going to do this because it's worth it for us, because you're going to pay that back in time as a representative, and we're going to take care of you and thus help you take care of your family, etc. And I don't see a lot of that. And like, even like that and I will say that's totally cynical on like movement conservatives part that they do that. I'm not sure it's as cynical in churches, and churches will occasionally do that too, but it's something like we won't do in the same way. At least I don't know of us doing it in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I've asked around a lot too since I started sort of looking at homeschools and now classical education stuff. I was really curious, right? Like, has any, I started asking people who were like the red diaper babies I knew, like, did you go somewhere? Was there like a camp, like Sunday, the equivalent of Sunday school or anything like this, and the answers are like eclectic, but they're not coherent in the way that you see. And that's I think it's really baffling. Like, I did this thing in high school. So like, I'm Latina, like first person to go to college, family, that kind of thing. I did this thing that I think is still operational in high school that was like all other Latinos, like very unusual, like since our colleague in common, our comrade Andres Bernal also did it. AOC also did it. It is running out of Maxwell, Texas. And it's at the time, right? Like at the time, I didn't really have a sense for what it was. It was like, okay, you seem like you might be college bound. You should meet other kids like you. And we should do some skills acquisition, but also you should just think about your subject position, let's say, and practice rhetorical arts, basically, right? Like debate and like youth legislature stuff. And it's like, well, how do you produce people who are in their 20s are really good on their feet? You put them with other kids who are also fighting about politics and economy, and you let them get to know each other in all the ordinary summer camp ways, and try out all their mean playground insults on each other as they cultivate a position, And I don't think it's an accident that when I run into other people who have a similar profile to myself, they know what this network is, but nobody outside of it seems to know what it is. So occasionally, right, it happens, but I don't even think that's a cynical position. It's like, it was great. It was amazing to get to meet other people who wanted to have conversations about, Latin American politics or something when you're a nerdy kid and it's just you and, you probably don't know anybody else, at least pre-internet, that cared about that stuff. Like, that's just basic social life, right?
Yeah, when I was a more traditional public school teacher, one of the things that I was really big on was academic games with recruiting not from the honors classes, but because the honors classes actually weren't even particularly helpful. I know I'm going to make a lot of conservatives mad about this, but it mostly codes for behavior, not intelligence. But like just really promising, mostly Black students in my school who were falling out and not being recruited to drama, etc. And the first school I worked at was also the school that I grew up in, and that was it's like a 60-40, no, or maybe close to 50-50 racially divided, because of the size of the county. There's actually weirdly no private school for white flight to happen. So the demographics of the school are actually, roughly speaking, the demographics of the county, and that's actually kind of weird in Georgia. But and I would do that because I realized that they would be, even though I also realized I was going to, like, even as late as 2005, 2006, 2007, when I first started doing this, yes, I'm exposing the people to like microaggressive racism from certain quarters. I realized that. And I realized it even back then before I had the words for it. But I also knew that I would be building them in the connections that they needed if they wanted to get into certain schools. And I had several kids from that program like go to pretty innovative colleges they wouldn't even heard about otherwise. And so I've always done stuff like that. I've always run debate programs for that reason too. And one of the things I've kind of changed about it is I didn't used to view that as a political project actually at all. And now I kind of do. Some of my foreigner students patronize my show. So it's like something that has, even to me, like been beneficial to me, and I wasn't thinking cynically about it whatsoever. But it is something that I think about. And when you talk to like, well, why isn't the DSA like doing this kind of outreach? You can kind of get it. Yeah. You can kind of get in the union stuff, although even their conception of union stuff mostly towards political battles immediately, which I often think is misguided. But that's a whole different thing. But I don't see them do it with other social organizations. Occasionally, you'll see GSA chapters go, well, maybe if we provide childcare, we get more women from working class communities because they probably need childcare. And I'm like, okay, yes, that's like step one and also obvious, but yes, I'm glad you did have that realization.
But what about like arts education, right? So like church is still probably, if you want to learn how to play a musical instrument or sing, you don't have money, the church is the place to go. Like no
even
contest.
More so now.
Right, exactly, because public school doesn't even provide that at this point. For most people, that's like a fancy schmancy thing that you're going to put a lot of extra effort into in terms of time and money. So if you want to build like the terroir of people who know a lot about music, you got to have some kind of aesthetic education that can handle people having exposure to the arts without having to be gifted professionals, right? And that's how you build audiences. That's how you build publics. That's how you sustain a couple people who might want to do it in innovative ways. But you want to be like cultivating the terroir. And so this is another one of those things where it's like, well, DSAs, et cetera, whatever, different organizations could totally do that kind of stuff where you provide something as a service to the community that is hard to get without entree through like capital.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting that it's hard to convince people that would be worth doing, because I'm like, no, but people would come on a regular basis to get that skill. Sports similarly too, and totally. Increasingly, like, I know people don't really realize this, outside of football, school is no longer a good and cheap way to get sports education. One, in a lot of states, the fees have gone up astronomically. I think like to be a cheerleader here is $2,000 or something. That's to a public school, and that's like they do waive it for like it's proportional to your waive to your proportional school lunch waiver, but still, it's still kind of crazy to think about. Because I'm like, yeah, like like I could never, my parents could never have afforded that. Like, and like, even with like the 20% off cheaper school lunch or something, there's no way. But uh, even beyond that, increasingly for a lot of sports that people like here care about, particularly like soccer uh, or football, that sort of thing, dancing, those are all club sports. And the club fees are even more expensive.
Yeah.
And I'm like, we have people that can do that. I know we'd have to deal with like liability insurance or whatever, and that's another cost. But as a side note, it's cheaper than trying to buy a candidate I'm actually gonna.
Right.
It's just
right.
It just makes me wonder, like, do you guys know how churches build people power? And I remember when anyone started talking about this at the DSA, you get automatically the left is not a church. And I'm like, well, a lot of things aren't churches. They still do what churches do.
Churches do things that churches shouldn't do. Like,
right.
like
churches making George is like half a church business.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
like it's but like that's neither here nor there. Like
neither here nor there.
Like these social functions are what they are, and I know they're harder to do, but and sometimes, I've had Anton Yeager on my show, and he was, but some ways bemoaning the decline of the social, and he got pushback for people saying that right wingers are also are damaged by this, even though I'm like, yeah, they are. This is something that's made church life a lot harder. But I have been increasingly going like, why do you think that is? Why have you just accepted, just because that it is, that we can't do anything about it?
Well, this is why I think it's so important to not to make the kind of decision to stop talking about social reproduction as the peripheral question of the secondary, though I don't think anybody consciously means to do it. It means that the hard stuff to solve, like the real material problems, can't be these social things. And then we're stuck in this kind of lamentation that the proof that there is an urgency to this task is this kind of accelerated technical financial march of time and history to make us ever more atomized, more and more isolated, fragmented, until either we end up in a utopian luxury of some kind or a planet of slums. And those are both like absurd and unsatisfying answers to the persistence of the social in the last instance, actually. Like E.P. Thompson, I don't know if you, like, he wrote this. Sometimes when I teach Althusser, I'll teach it with this E.P. Thompson, like, super long essay about like taking Althusser down, called about an orrery of errors, where he's just really pissed about it, right? And it's just snarky.
I make my my Artusarian friends read it before they come on my show, I actually, for real.
Oh man, that's sick burn. Right, but he's constantly like, what is this last instance, right, that never arrives? You're like, he's kind of got a point, right? It's like, come on, like you can't see the ground to the determinative thing. That's very silly. Like, just track what's there, and then how do you kind of create the sorts of the loops, that give you enough to constitutively move something,
Yeah, I think this is. I'm actually thinking, like, I just got Martin Jay's totality book, because I come from a very Frankfurt School oriented orientation, and it's taken me a long time to sort of like get beyond that. But I was like, well, if you view everything as an interlocked totality, then no wonder you like think that like thinking is the only thing you could possibly do to like get out of that interlocked totality, because you've already made it where there's no movement possible. Right. And also, frankly, I don't know how you think new social movements ever emerged in the first place. Like, and I think about that when we talk about like the social reproduction versus reproduction problem, because our production problem. See, even I don't think we can separate those out anymore. Like, that's where I'm at.
So I agree.
Like, and so that was the question when we started talking about this, and you're like, and I was like, oh yeah, like like, because this has become increasingly something I think about my life. Like when I was thinking about, like, well, how does capitalism affect your love life? And I was like, well, there's the obvious ways, but there's a whole lot of unobvious ways. But some of these things are pre-capital, like gender relation issues are. I don't know of a society, even relatively egalitarian ones, that do not have them.
Right.
Um, uh,
We've just
and
pissed off like a lot of people. You know that, right?
I know. um, but, yeah, there's a whole lot of like very subtle digs that have been coming out of this conversation. But I don't know, like, I don't know societies that don't have that. And I remember talking with a social reproduction theorist who kept on talking about male gender relations being informed by capital, and I'm like, I mean, they are, but like, I don't know. I feel like these problems are older than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and what you start seeing is they do affect political economy. I know that, like I mentioned, Christopher Ryan brought up the Mizou as like this example, and he was doing it about polyamory. But I'm like, yeah, but they have a completely different political economy, and also, even though they weren't hostile to the state, Mao felt like he needed to bust them up because he couldn't figure out how they figured into a communist political economy that's still based off capitalist production, because they had been able to stay outside of it, like, and be stable for forever. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know that we always want to just bust those things up and not like learn from them in some way, like pretty crucially. Because that leads us to this other irony that we haven't really talked about, but the irony of like Marxists in particular of spreading the thing that they hate so they can defeat it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right.
It's just
Yeah.
like, we're going to spread nationalism and capitalism everywhere so we can also undo it. Wait, what?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's one that I still like wrap my head around. Or when we start talking about indigenous issues or whatever, and they're like, well, we don't know what to do about the indigenous because it's outside of this. And I'm
Right.
like, well, I don't know, give them relative autonomy over a fair chunk of land, and I don't think it matters. I don't know.
Well,
It's
so I
me.
mean, I think you could think about it as like, or I think about it as like, okay, so what are the methodological, what kind of social inquiry do we need, right? What are some sort of, what's on the wish list, you know? It's like, okay, well, culture cannot be exogenous. It can't be like this culture versus that culture. And it can't be epiphenomenal. You know, we've got to have some kind of more endogenous language for cultural processes so that we don't have like this thing over there or far away. And that's that. So it has to be overtaken or set apart as difference. That just doesn't feel like a satisfying answer. So we need to think endogenously. We need to have some models that don't come from the kind of modern liberal framework, not because we're trying to return to them, but just because we need some other models so that we can put on different glasses and try to figure out what something is, you know, because otherwise, yeah, we pre-board the analytics, which actually just isn't very good for our inquiries, and we stay pretty stuck, you know. So I mean, like around like I guess 2015. So this was like 2015, 2016. I think I must have been right around baby 2, right? So I'm like, I'm not going anywhere. Like I fully am in the reproductive whatever realities of my conditions. I started this like reading group was like open to everyone. At first we had this whole fight, like should we be a feminist economics group? And there were people who were like, no, don't call it feminist because no boys will come, you know, kind of thing. And so we sort of settled on thinking about the oikos like as kinship economy is just trying to put some other starting point in front of ourselves, not because we want to return to antiquity or something, but because we wanted to think about the span of economic relations where the household and the polity were blatantly in relation to one another, not the individual and the public private. And it's been super generative, just to read stuff from other periods that work that way and not read them with the eye of like I'm looking for the right solution for how to run society. But just like, I don't want to naturalize my categories. I want to be able to think about what's a useful category to build to get the work done.
That's actually, that's a great place to kind of wrap this up. But I also think that's a great point, because I've been thinking a lot more about framework modularity or whatever, because it's increasingly become obvious to me. One, I've just been arguing with Marxists for years that if you don't put something in Marxological terminology, they'll never take it seriously, because they just don't believe that something it isn't in their jargon is real, even though they often don't understand their jargon. And you could tell it annoys me so bad that I remove myself from the we in that. Like, I'm just like, oh God, like, just like, we're not talking about we's anymore. Normally I'm a Marxist too, but this is so annoying. But I've also been thinking about it, like, when we approach, like, I've been telling people, for example, if you want to look at like societies that don't have a like very high hierarchical barrier between people, you do need to look at them, their context, and how they understand the world. All three. Not like, in fact, I was a little bit critical of David Graeber for not looking at the context, but I think it's important that he does put back the frameworks matter. And I think we need to do a lot more of it, because we've been stuck in the same like conceptual cul-de-sacs now for a long time. I mean, I keep going back and I dig deeper, and I'm like, oh, we've been debating the same shit since like 1920. It's like literally 100 years. Like,
yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, I think your show is really interesting in that way, though, because you do take a pretty big tent approach, and that means you're doing a lot of code switching and translating. And I think hearing people code switch and let things be partial, that there are many kinds of voices that can move through the same topics in different fashions, shakes things a little bit, right? It says you don't have to talk in the proper way to be at the table. There are several kinds of people who think about these things that don't talk the same way. And maybe that, I mean, I find that a very hopeful provocation for saying, like, there's actually a lot of mysteries and work to be done. And that's good, right? Like, we're not out of ideas.
But thanks. Learning to teach people to code switch was crucial for just like when I first became a teacher, just like on the, okay, I don't want to make everyone speak Whitey language, but I also know if they don't speak Whitey language, they're not gonna get a job. So let's try to reframe this. And then I went back and found Stuart Hall, and like, it was, even though, yes, we could talk about how Stuart Hall's been removed from his radical context, blah, 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 but it was really useful. And then I've now just increasingly think, like, I need to do this between disciplines, because a lot of disciplines right now cannot talk to each other, and definitely can't present it to the fucking general public, because they're so enamored with the prestidigitation of their own words. Like, it's just, but
they're thinking's hard. I mean, sometimes I think, like, I bet a lot of these people would talk many ways if they were, I mean, as you know, right? Like, language is really hard.
That's true.
So we need the poets. They're desperately required, right? Actually, they make these kinds of switches possible so that we can build together. And I don't want to undervalue how skillful that is for making social life.
Yeah, that fights against my own tendency to kick the poets out just because I hang out with them and am one. So it's just, people are, it's like, it's funny. I took the implicit bias test recently, and it was like, you just like white people and Jews. And I'm like, I don't, like, most people show that they like are biased towards themselves, and apparently I just don't like people who are like me. But it's just, I don't know. It's pretty obvious what that says, but it is a thing, and these skills need to be transferable, and particularly, I know it makes people uncomfortable to start thinking, like, why are conservatives able to do this? What are they doing? And what people tend to take away, unfortunately, is when people start like, what we can learn from conservatives, let's like mirror their bigoted ideology. And I'm like, oh God.
Right.
That's the wrong
Exactly.
lesson.
Exactly.
Like, that's not what makes them appealing, actually.
Right.
Like,
But we
that's
need
like,
semioticians, right? We need people to pull apart the practice from the associations and the qualia and note that these are different things. And you can take those connotations and rejigger this way. And you can take the practice and move it away from the denotation. And these are not the same, right? And that's a good analytic kind of habit of mind. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, thank you for doing this and for the work you're doing. And
Thanks.
you know, it's
Thank
lovely.
you. Thank you for the work you're doing. Hopefully people outside of academia read it. So where can people find your work?
So you can, I mean, I'm a professor, so I'm decently public. And if there's something that people can't find, like I'm first and foremost sort of a teacher, so you can always reach out and find me, and I'll, I'm happy to talk and learn together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You will be amused to know that I consider you part of pro-social Twitter.
Oh, what's pro-social
so
Twitter?
I have pro-social Twitter and anti-social Twitter. Most Twitter is anti-social. This is a stupid binary, but it's where I'm like, oh, I read this person because I learned something from them, as opposed to I read this person because I'm going to argue with them.
Oh.
So like pro-social learning, anti-social arguing. And so yeah, so I would tell people to check out your Twitter. It's actually remarkably not super snarky, which
No, I'm so earnest. It's totally the opposite. I'm super earnest, but that totally means like also I'm totally comfortable with argument. It doesn't ruffle my feathers. I don't take it personally. If people have questions or they disagree, like I'm pretty patient, with that, and always happy to learn more and be wrong. It's okay.
Yeah. So follow Erica on Twitter.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Okay. Bye. Have a great day.
You too.